Hello, this is Piyush Chaudhary, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Hansraj College, welcoming you all to Hansraj e-Samvaad, a center established under the aegis of Mahatma Hansraj Faculty Development Center under Ministry of Education, Government of India. I welcome you all to this another lecture series. Today we'll be discussing the unit Sufi and Bhakti literary traditions in India and how the literature emerged from this area. We'll also be discussing the various features of Sufi and Bhakti literature, and we'll try to correlate it with the two chapters in this unit, that is Mahadevi Akka's Vachan and Bengali Baul Bhakti songs, as well as Kafi number 7 by Bulle Shah. Let me now firstly discuss the Sufi and the Bhakti traditions in India. I'll be firstly introducing what Sufi and Bhakti movement actually is. So basically this movement influenced firstly not just the Muslims but equally the Hindus as well, because it gave a common platform to these Sufi mystics. These mystics were persons of deep devotion, and there was a revolt against the hardlining ideology of Islam as well as the hardlining Brahmanical display of wealth in religious rituals in Hinduism. Also, there was this hatred of extravagant display of religious fanaticism under the Muslim Islamic rule and the Islamic kingdoms and the Mughal rules of that time. So therefore, it is very easily concluded just by noting this particular point that Sufi and Bhakti movements were in a way revolutionary movements, and their revolution is clearly visible in the literature that was produced in these movements. The Sufi and the Bhakti movement basically flourished because it was very simple. It was free from idol worship. It was free from hatred. It was free from fanaticism. It was free from religious communalism or fanaticism. It was free from difficult rituals, and therefore it emerged as an alternative to dominant ideology and the dominant religion in the 12th to 16th century India. Also, the Sufi and the Bhakti movement can be considered as an anti-caste movement. It was a revolt against the caste-based discrimination against the untouchables as well. So the Sufi and the Bhakti tradition both had lot of similarities. Both believed in monotheism. There was a belief in only one God. In both Sufi and Bhakti tradition, one can see that there were several songs which were used to propagate their ideas as well. Right? The Bhakti and the Sufi traditions also had several similarities. Firstly, both of them, form what is broadly known as Indian religious poetry. But this poetry is composed of the intermingling of Sufi and Bhakti literature. In fact, there are certain critics who believe that Sufi and Bhakti movements are in fact one, but they have different roots, right? But notwithstanding any of it, they share many ideological similarities as well. There is a certain amount of what you can say thematic resemblance and similarity in both of them, and these similarities are spread across the length and breadth of the Sufi and Bhakti movement and the literature that this movement had basically produced. Firstly, there is the unity of God. There is the idea of the unity of being and the unity of God. Secondly, there is this idea of the relationship between the worship and the God, and this relationship is very intimate. Thirdly, you will see that there is no sense of self in Sufi and Bhakti poetry. Whatever self is there in the poet worships it, right? And it donates it to the God, so that there is no sense of self. There is no sense of self. In the sense, there is no identity. Fourthly, one of the major themes is the idea of the mad lover, and this is what we are going to do today in Sisir Kumar Das' essay. Right? The idea of a person madly in love with God is visible in both Bhakti as well as Sufi traditions. Right? Fifthly, there is also a strong sense of longing and a strong desire to obtain their God. The main ultimate goal of the poet is union with the God. And this unity and this union with the God is ineffable. You can say so, right? So in this case, the essay by Sisir Kumar Das, which is titled The Mad Lover, I will now go to that. I just gave you a brief introduction about the Sufi and the Bhakti traditions and the various features of Sufi and Bhakti tradition. But what is more important is the essay by Sisir Kumar Das. He was a professor at the University of Delhi. This essay shows how Sufi poets and Indian religious Bhakti poets shared the same intensity in their love for God. Their love for God is basically so revolutionary that Sisir Kumar Das believes that because of their frenzied state of worshipping, it means that the poet completely absorbs himself or herself in devotion. So therefore, these poets, as you know, in the case of Mahadevi, in the case of Bulle Shah, it can easily be concluded that they are mad lovers because they yearn to be united with the God. They are desperate to be united with the God. And that too, for example, in the case of Mahadevi, we'll read her stories, we'll read her poems shortly. In the highly stratified 12th century, the patriarchal and 12th century society, her views are nothing short of being extremely revolutionary in nature, right? So there is also what you can see a sense of bliss or a sense of metaphysical unity, a trance-like state of the mind that the poet finds himself in. In the case of Bulle Shah or Mahadevi Akka, we see how they worship God, how they are seeking God. So, there is this sense of union with the God and ecstasy, which is quite visible in their poetry. Overall, in one line, we can say that the approach of Bhakti and Sufi tradition was humanistic in nature. Can we say this? Of course, the human was, appealed rather than Hindu or a Muslim. Humanity was their religion. And it was basically, as I mentioned, it was a revolt against orthodoxy in both Islam as well as in Hinduism. Like Buddhism was also a revolt against the corruption and the authorities of Brahmanism. Similarly, Sufi and Bhakti tradition was a revolt against the orthodoxy of Hinduism, against Brahmanism, as well as the hardcore, hard-lining ideology of Islam and the religious fanaticism practiced in the Mughal age in Islam. Right? So both Sufi and Bhakti traditions, they are endless. They encompass a wide range of themes, but the basic doctrine is love for the ultimate one. The ultimate one is the only God. Therefore, in a world in the medieval era, which was divided firmly on the basis of religious lines, which was divided firmly on Hinduism, which was divided firmly on the hardcore Muslim fanaticism, the Sufi and the Bhakti traditions are nothing but a revolt against the dominant ideology of those times. So there is revolt at the heart of Sufi and Bhakti literature. We have to understand that, right? It is revolt against the dominant beliefs. It is a revolt against the existing forms of worship. It is a revolt against the existing forms of literature and poetry as well. And fourthly, against the existing form of social codes and behaviors, right? So in this essay, which is titled The Mad Lover, the author Sisir Kumar Das, who was also a professor at the University of Delhi, he uses the metaphor of the mad lover to describe the basic features of Sufi and Bhakti tradition. Firstly, let us look at the mad lover. When we call someone mad, we basically free them from all social bonds and images. So the idea of madness is also kind of a liberation, as you need not follow the societal rules and conventions of the popular society. So you are called mad if you do not adhere to the socially acceptable ideas and rules. Therefore, madness is exclusion from society. And both the Sufi and the Bhakti poets, they exhibited this sense of exclusivity because they did not follow the dominant social and religious conventions of the times. So there is this element of madness, of obsession, which is directed toward the God. They get mad in their love with the God, which also takes the form of their beloved. The God becomes their beloved. These are revolutionary ideas. Right? With this, let us start discussing the essay, and I will touch upon the major themes that Sisir Kumar Das has, touched upon in this essay. For example, the essay begins firstly with the features of medieval religious poetry, and he says that there is a feeling of ecstasy and the feeling of devotion for the union with God. Look at these lines to understand what he says. He says, and I'm quoting it: "Here is a piercing cry of the devotee, a storm lashing on the forests, waves surging on the beach, unflickering flamings being replaced by a mad lover, which is indeed the most conspicuous and the most recurrent imagery in the medieval religious poetry." Right? So the essay begins with these lines in the very first paragraph by Professor Das, where he describes the features of medieval religious poetry. Then in the very next paragraph, he describes the features of Bhakti movement. And he says that the Bhakti movement was basically a movement of the common people, and the Bhakti poets basically were revolting, against the established religions and were challenging the social conventions, right? Then he also goes on to explain how the God in Bhakti tradition is very close to the heart of the common man, right? So Das begins his essay, The Mad Lover, with a sentence on ecstatic spiritual longing of Sufi and Bhakti devotees in the medieval period in India. So he explains about the origin of Sufism. He explains the journey and the spread of Sufi lovers from Basra, which is in Sindh, and all the way to Pakistan, from the modern day Pakistan and India. So Sufi and Bhakti tradition had developed independently, both Sufi and Bhakti, but their way of relating to the divine was almost the same. So the imagery of the mad lover was common in both these traditions. He goes on to tell how Professor Das tells how Sufism was anti-Quranic and anti-Islamic. It revolted against the fanaticism and the hardcore ideology of Islam, right? And then he goes on to explain how Sufism also grew up as kind of a attitude against the ruling class, right? Some of the other features of Sufism that Professor Das tells us are that there is an approach towards God through love. You reach God through devotion, of course, but there is a form of love as well. Then look at how Sufism was accepted when it came to India. Sisir Kumar Das says that it was accepted as if it was very common and as if it was a part of the Indian tradition only. Okay, so look at these lines. He says one thing is absolutely clear in the text. I'm reading from the text. One thing is absolutely clear. When Sufism came to India with its features of fana and dhikr and satna, singing and dancing, the doctrines of tawakkul Allah, total dependence on God's mercy, its emphasis on the role of murshid as the guide and the mashuk ashik, who is the beloved lover framework, the common Indian did not find them exotic at all, but they found it very similar, if not almost identical with their own. So the question of either accepting them or rejecting them was irrelevant. The Sufi thought permeated naturally into the Indian national psyche, right? So therefore, in these lines, Professor Das is saying that the Sufi tradition was accepted and received in India as it was already a part of India, right? So we can therefore conclude that Sufism and Bhaktism are more or less similar. This is again a point by which we can conclude, even if they were independent, slightly different, but the common goal was same. Right? Then he goes on to explain about the idea of madness, which is important. He says the madness of the lover was common even in Sanskrit literature, right? And madness was considered best if it is directed towards God. So therefore the idea of the Ras Leela of Krishna and the gopis and the idea of the mad love of Mahadevi and several other Persian Sufi poets was also directed towards God. He says that the word mad is not negative. It does not have a negative connotation in the Hindu religious context, right? Similarly, Mahadevi Akka, she is completely mad in love with Lord Shiv. We will read her poem very shortly in the next lecture. Then Professor Das also goes on to explain some changes, why he has observed, the changes he has observed in Bhakti poetry over time. And he mentions these, and I'm quoting it. It is sufficient for us, he says, to remember that the frenzied devotional frenzy that dominated the Bhakti movement found its most congenial medium in the framework of love poetry. In the Radha legend, the expression assumed a new form. The participants are Radha and Krishna, and the poet is the narrator. So the secular elements were more pronounced in the Radha poems than in the lyrics of saints addressed to God, right? So these points which we just now read they go on to show how some changes were also seen in Bhakti poetry over time. Right? First is the framework of the love poetry and how the love poetry was mixed with Bhakti literature. Then the second change was that a new lyrical form was coming and the narrator is describing their experience. And the third change that he is mentioning in these lines is that there was a secular element as well, right? And secular poems were becoming common, right? So these are some of the ideas. So basically he says that because of these, secular elements also started entering the Sufi poetry. Right? So therefore Professor Das is telling us how several movements affect each other in different ways. We have to understand this. When we understand, if you remember my previous lecture by Sujit Mukherjee, we talked about how literary forms travel from one place to another and how literary movements affect each other. This is exactly what is being done here, which is being discussed here, right? So how the Indian Bhakti tradition also affected the Persian Sufi tradition. So this is the give and take. But look at these lines, these are important. He says that the idea of separation of the human soul from God developed into a love symbolism where the soul assumed the image of a mad lover. The union is the goal and the joy of the union is ineffable, but poetry lies in the process of the union rather than in the union itself. Therefore, both in Sufi poetry as well as in Bhakti poetry, it is the theme of longing and waiting for God, the theme of one's journey towards the beloved, which dominates. So, therefore, in these lines, Professor Das is giving us more features of Sufi and Bhakti poetry. The paragraph that I just now read, it includes some of the major features of Sufi and Bhakti poetry. You can read it again, right? So, these are some ideas. So, the ultimate effort, he says, is to achieve the God, and God, mostly in Sufi and Bhakti traditions, God is the beloved. So, the paragraph which I just now read, it will be helpful in analyzing the various texts that are there in this unit. For example, firstly we will begin with Mahadevi's Vachan, then we will go to Kafi number 7 by Bulle Shah, Kafi 7, right, and lastly we will read the Bengali Baul songs as well. So, therefore, the paragraph which we just now read will be helpful in you can say analyzing the various texts in this particular unit. With this, I come to the end of this lecture and this essay by Sisir Kumar Das. I will be covering other parts of the GE readings on Indian diversity and literary movements, and of course, I will be uploading them on our YouTube channels soon. So, please stay posted on this channel and do let me know in the comment box in case there is any such query or doubts. I will see you shortly again. Goodbye, all the best, and Jai Hind.